My dear one, I send you blessings of peace, light, and infinite love. Welcome to Angel's message for you. There is a specific reason you found this message today. It is not a coincidence. You have been holding on to a feeling, a connection that seems to defy logic, and lately the silence has been loud. You may have asked yourself if you were imagining it all, or if it is time to finally let go. But before you make that choice, I ask you to listen closely and stay with me until the very end of this message. Because what looks like distance to the human eye is actually a profound spiritual process that is about to bear fruit. The wait hasn't been empty. It has been the soil for a miracle. My dear one, there are feelings that grow stronger when we stop trying to control them and instead place them in the care of the divine. Your love did exactly that. It wasn't out of weakness that things grew quiet between you and this person. It was out of wisdom. In the midst of so many uncertainties and confusing paths, this person you hold in your heart understood something vital. There is no safer place than God's heart to keep a true love. That is where this connection was placed. And since then, it has been cared for, protected, and prepared with a level of attention that only heaven can offer. I know there are days that feel too confusing. I know there are moments when everything you feel seems hard to explain to your friends or family. But even so, the love that was entrusted to the universe did not weaken. On the contrary, it grew in a different way. It grew in the silence of prayers, in sincere conversations with the divine, and in the nights when your soulmate asked that this feeling not be forgotten, only cared for until the time was right. This surrender was not made as someone who walks away or gives up. It was made as someone who trusts. Leaving this love in God's hands was the most beautiful way your soulmate found to avoid losing what they feel for you. Because there are things the human heart can no longer carry alone. This person knew how to recognize the moment to stop trying to force outcomes. Instead of insisting on rushed actions that might have ruined everything, they chose to place what was too alive to be ignored on the altar of divine timing. And that choice changed the timeline of your destiny. Today, I come to you with a revelation. It is about what is moving within the heart of the one you carry in your thoughts. This is not about regret, nor about missing what has passed. It is about a love that was never abandoned, only kept in a spiritual vault where no one else could touch it. This surrender was made with faith, with the certainty that at the right moment, everything that seemed impossible would become the path forward. You are not alone in this waiting that seems to have no name. Your person has also been carrying this feeling with an intensity that goes beyond any logical explanation. Even if nothing has been spoken out loud, so much has already been felt between you two in the energy realm. Only now, everything begins to take shape in the physical world. The time of waiting was not in vain. It was necessary so that what is coming could be prepared in the right way. On the days when everything seemed still, something was being built. When it looked like nothing was happening, the angels were at work. Because when a love is entrusted to the divine, it is no longer the world's clock that determines the steps. It is spiritual timing that leads. And that timing has just opened up. The surrender made in silence now begins to show signs that it is being answered. You may have wondered whether the feeling still existed on their end. But what is about to be revealed proves that it not only exists, it was strengthened by the distance. Your love did not disappear. It simply trusted that what is true is never lost. It only waits for the moment it can be lived fully and without fear. What I want to tell you goes far beyond beautiful words. It is about a feeling that was taken seriously, a feeling that was kept in prayer when nothing seemed right. When someone places this kind of love in God's hands, They are choosing the safest chance for everything to happen in the best possible way. That is what was done with the love between you. There comes a moment when a feeling goes beyond what someone can hold on to alone. That is exactly what happened with your soulmate. As much as they tried to stay in control, to understand the signs and deal with everything rationally, there came a point when their heart could no longer handle the intensity of what was growing. The connection between you never stopped pulsing. And as time went by, this person felt more and more that they were facing something greater than they could resolve on their own. That was when the decision came to surrender, not as someone giving up, but as someone who recognizes that there is a stronger force guiding this story. It was a true surrender made with care and with respect for what you both represent to one another. This person knew that this feeling was rare, so instead of risking it with immature actions, they chose to trust. They asked heaven to take over what no longer fit within their own hands. And when a surrender like that happens, it shifts the energy. Your soulmate began to act differently in their private moments. They started placing every detail of this feeling into the light, not to pull away but to protect it. Because when we love for real, we don't want to act impulsively. We want to make sure everything happens the right way at the right time. Now, something new begins to emerge. It is no longer about doubt or waiting in the dark. It is about the answer that comes after faith. This person felt in a very personal moment that they could no longer keep all of this trapped inside. So they made room for the divine to take care of it. And since then, many things have begun to change, because what is guided by heaven finds paths that no one else can open. This surrender also came at a cost to them. There were nights when this person had to hold their own heart back, even with the urge to reach out to you. There were days when the feeling seemed too strong to keep contained. Even so, the choice was to trust the process. Your soulmate believes that love, when it is sincere, does not get lost when entrusted to the universe. It grows stronger. It gains purpose. It gains direction. Today, you are being prepared to understand what this attitude truly means. What is coming is not by chance. It is an answer. It is part of what this person asked for with so much faith. Over time, you will realize that every step was aligned so that this connection could be lived in the truest way possible. Many people try to hold on to love tightly out of fear of losing it. But your person chose the harder path, letting go of control and trusting. This kind of surrender only happens when the feeling is strong enough to go beyond fear. That is what allowed this connection to reach this point. That is what kept everything alive even without physical presence. Time passed, but what was placed in the divine's care was nurtured every single day. This person did not surrender and forget. They surrendered and kept asking, kept believing, kept connecting in thought with the certainty that when it was safe, love would find its way back. And that is why you are hearing this message now. Because the time of preparation is coming to an end. The time of the answer is beginning. Your soulmate no longer wants to keep this feeling hidden only within themselves. It isn't because they grew tired of waiting, but because they understood that the right moment is finally taking shape. The choice to trust that everything would come at the right time is bringing exactly what this person believed was possible. When love no longer fits in human hands, it needs to be entrusted to heaven. And when that happens, the answer always comes. Sometimes not in the way we expect, but always in the way we need. And what is coming to you is an answer that no longer depends on human uncertainties. Comes with direction. What your soulmate feels now is no longer doubt. It is certainty. And that certainty did not come out of nowhere. It was born from the process of trusting, of waiting patiently, of keeping the connection alive even when everything seemed still. This person understood that you cannot live a whole love with hands full of fear. That is why they decided to place everything in the hands that know best how to care. Time has passed, but the feeling has not been lost. It has not been worn down or erased by circumstances. What is placed in God's hands does not grow weaker with waiting. On the contrary, it grows stronger. What is being revealed now is precisely the strength of a love that does not depend on physical presence to continue existing. Your soulmate did not give up. They simply understood that they needed to trust in divine timing. This love was nurtured quietly but firmly. Even when the path seemed far apart, something within that person knew the feeling had not changed. Contrary to what many think, when there is a true surrender of the heart, time does not turn into distance. It becomes preparation, and that is exactly what happened. Your soulmate did not cling to what they could not control, but they also did not allow this love to fade away. Instead of trying to understand everything in a rush, this person chose to stand firm in faith. What sustained this feeling was not expectation but conviction. A certainty built little by little, day after day, even without clear answers. When one loves with this kind of awareness, time does not destroy, teaches. It organizes what once seemed confusing. It strengthens the roots of what was planted in truth. This person did not wait for answers in empty actions. They waited in prayer. They kept what they felt before the divine with the intention that everything would be guided in a pure way. This does not mean an absence of feeling, much less weakness. It means maturity, and more than that, it means faith, because those who love and trust understand that what comes from the universe is not undone by delay. This journey was not without weight. There were days when your soulmate's heart felt tight, and moments when everything seemed far too distant. But even then, faith spoke louder. That is what kept the love alive. Because when a feeling is sustained by spirituality, it does not collapse in the face of difficulties. It reshapes itself, reorganizes itself, but it remains there, waiting for the right time to bloom. This person understood that the love they feel for you is not ordinary. That is why they treated it with such care. Even when much of what surrounded them made no sense, there was something steady in their chest saying that this feeling still had a purpose. And now, looking back at all that was lived during this time, your soulmate's heart finds peace because they see they were not believing in vain. There is a spiritual truth that says we must be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. This message connects deeply with everything this person lived in relation to you. There was patience, yes, but there was also perseverance. And above all, there was hope. Not an empty hope, but one that was nourished every day with thoughts turned toward you. This person never stopped believing that this love would one day be fully lived. As time passed, many things changed. New understandings came, wounds were healed, and all of this happened because the love was not left to be lost. It was placed in spiritual timing so it could grow in a more mature way. And now, what is being returned to your soulmate's heart is the certainty that this waiting had meaning. That this feeling remains ready to be lived, not in the old way, but in the best way. The prayers made for this love did not fade into the air. They took root, and everything that is being revealed now is an answer to a process that began long before this message reached you. There was surrender, there was faith, there was care in every choice. This person did not want time to be a problem. They wanted it to be part of the solution, and so they continued, even without knowing when everything would begin to change. Now that the answer is drawing near, it is impossible to ignore the strength this love carried throughout all this time. It survived the waiting because it was planted in the right place. It was not cultivated out of neediness. It was sustained by purpose. It was taken seriously. And now, with the universe releasing what was kept, everything begins to make sense. Your soulmate knows what they feel. They no longer need signs to believe. This clarity did not come overnight. It was built throughout this time in silent conversations with the divine, in choices, in moments when the heart decided not to give up. It was this process that gave firmness to what once seemed uncertain. This love endured because it was not forced. It was cared for with patience. It was brought before the divine so it could receive direction, not confusion. And that is why you are hearing this now, because time has fulfilled its role. What your soulmate feels today is more than a feeling. It is a decision. It is a clear desire to live what was sustained throughout all this time with faith. Nothing was wasted. Not the days when it seemed everything had stopped, nor the nights when this person withdrew into prayer asking for direction. Everything served to strengthen what exists between you, and now what is being released is the fruit of that journey. It is not something that began now. It is the result of everything that was built even when there were no guarantees. The feeling your soulmate carries did not fade with time. It only gained deeper meaning. What comes next will be guided by the strength that withstood everything that tried to weaken it. Now is the time to recognize that this love was not lost. It was protected. And when the divine protects, nothing that comes afterward is small. Everything carries a greater purpose. My dear one, what was felt between you did not lose its value. That love was not left behind, not forgotten, and certainly not ignored. What happened was something wiser and more genuine than any apparent distance could show. Your love made a choice not to leave the feeling in the hands of chance. They kept what they felt in the only place where nothing and no one could interfere, within the intimacy of faith. This decision to protect love instead of trying to erase it shows how special you are to this person. When something isn't ready to be lived out, many people give up or try to move on as if nothing ever existed. But that wasn't the case here. This person understood that it was impossible to go on pretending they felt nothing. Instead of trying to forget, they chose to preserve it. While many believe that loving is simply about having someone close, your soulmate chose to believe that real love is the kind that survives time, waiting, and the days when nothing seems to make sense. They placed these feelings where no confusion could touch them, knowing that what is cared for by heaven doesn't wear out. It only matures. It is hard for many people to understand this kind of choice. The world teaches us to move on quickly, as if feeling deeply were a mistake. But your person went against the rush. They chose the path of care. And that is exactly why this connection is still alive. Now, all of this is beginning to take on new meaning. In the middle of their own inner conflicts, this person realized they could no longer try to solve everything through impulsive actions. It was necessary to trust in something greater. This love was offered up in prayer, not as a way to avoid responsibility, but as an act of spiritual maturity. They wanted to do what was right, not what was easiest. There is ancient wisdom that speaks about committing your way to the divine and trusting that it will come to pass. Your soulmate did exactly that. They entrusted the path of the love they feel for you, not out of fear, but out of faith. Because when you truly trust, you understand that it's not our timing that rules, but the perfect timing of the universe. This surrender carried weight. It carried truth. Your soulmate no longer wanted to risk letting human doubts contaminate something that was too strong to be forgotten. They chose to trust that if it were meant to happen, it would happen in the best possible way. And that doesn't mean absence. It means presence even when the eyes can't see. It means keeping the connection alive even when there are no guarantees. That's how this love remained protected. It wasn't locked away. It was cared for. This person moved forward with life, yes, but without erasing what they felt. Because when the heart still believes in something, it's impossible to pretend nothing ever happened. Your soulmate realized it wasn't time to act on impulse, so they withdrew into thoughts that only the divine could hear. Now, life is starting to give answers. What once seemed still is beginning to move. Not by chance, but because what was kept in the spiritual realm is now starting to be released into reality. It is a direct response to what was sincerely placed before God. This person didn't choose distance out of weakness, but out of wisdom. They understood that some connections can only be rebuilt when the right time arrives. And now, with everything that was planted in faith, what is being born is the fruit of that care. Love that is kept. In prayer doesn't die. It grows in a different way. It grows within those who believe and blooms in the time chosen by the divine. This person didn't want to love you just anyway. They wanted to make it work in the right way. And because of that, they accepted waiting. Now everything is starting to make sense. You are being called to understand what lies ahead. Because this offering your soulmate made was not forgotten. It was heard, received, and now it is being returned with direction. It won't be an ordinary return. It will be the kind of love that crosses time, kept in the most sacred place. And when that happens, nothing that comes afterward is empty. Everything carries purpose. This person's intention was never to erase what they felt. It was to protect the feeling until it could be shown through action. That moment is approaching. You may not have imagined how all of this would be revealed, but now you're beginning to sense that something greater is guiding everything. That force comes directly from the surrender that was made some time ago. All of this is a direct consequence of the love that was offered in prayer. A feeling that wasn't set aside but guarded where no opposing voice could erase it. As spiritual timing opens the way, you will understand why everything happened the way it did. Nothing was in vain. The love that was placed in God's hands did not disappear. It was prepared. The feeling was not merely kept. It was presented to the divine with a name and a direction. Your soulmate did not speak of a vague desire. They spoke of you. With faith, they pointed to the path the heart already knew and asked that this path would not be interrupted, even if the eyes could not yet see any sign. It was not an ordinary conversation with the universe. It was one of those moments born when the heart is full of longing, full of feeling, full of truth. When someone speaks to heaven like that, the request does not get lost along the way. The name held in their heart was carried into the spiritual realm with the strength of someone who believes that pure love deserves to continue. While the world seemed to move in another direction, this person remained focused on what they felt. There was no pressure, no empty attempts to force destiny. Your soulmate asked that if there were still a possible space for this love to happen in a light and rightful way, it would be revealed with clarity. Not with doubt, but with the certainty that only heaven can bring. This request was repeated more than once. It was not made only in a moment of need, but on days when the heart felt it had to trust. And every time your name was spoken in the quiet of their heart, something new began to move. Because when an intention is filled with true feeling, the universe listens differently. The love this person feels for you is not offered timidly. It was carried with strength, with courage, and with faith. In prayer, this person did not ask only for a chance. They also asked for peace for your heart. They asked that wherever you were, there would be calm, understanding, and preparation. because this love was never about conquest. It was about connection. Your soulmate did not speak only of what they wanted to live, but of the good they wished for you. That is what makes everything stronger. A feeling that thinks of the other even when there is still no guarantee of return. The request reached the highest realms without hiding what truly mattered. It was direct, it was honest, and it was heard. Heaven began preparing the paths from that moment on. Some things needed to be moved out of place. Some answers took longer than this person expected. But nothing was ignored. Time did not cancel the surrender. It only served to place everything on the right axis. There is a promise that whatever you ask in prayer, if you believe, you will receive. It was with this faith that your soulmate spoke, believing that the love still alive within their chest would find its way back to you. And it is this conviction that now causes everything to begin to change. These conversations were not meant to ease a momentary pain. They were meant to seal a purpose. And this purpose has a name. It is about you, about the connection that still pulses, about everything that can still be lived, not with haste, but with awareness. This person asked for more than a meeting. They asked for transformation. They asked for the chance to live something built on a solid foundation, on respect, on care. And when someone asks in this way, they are committing. They are saying to the universe, if this love is to be lived, let it be in the most beautiful way possible. Now this request begins to take shape in actions, in signs, in subtle movements showing that divine permission has been released. This person knows that what they feel is not common. And that is why they made a point of placing everything in God's hands before taking any step. Not to hide behind faith, but to ensure that whatever happened from then on would have roots and preparation. Now, with a heart strengthened by everything lived in prayer, your soulmate is ready to take the next steps. You may not even imagine what was spoken in your name, but every word carried truth, and that changes everything. Because when someone prays for you with this kind of surrender, something always happens. Not always in the way we expect, but in the right way. You will begin to notice that this love is being returned with meaning, with direction, and with the same sincerity with which it was offered. There are moments when the body is still, but the soul has already begun to move. That is exactly what is happening now. Something has been awakened with intensity inside them. This person carries within an emotional urgency that can no longer be hidden. It isn't anxiety. It is the awareness that a feeling is ready to be lived and that this time is drawing near. Even before any outward action, something inside this person has already begun to organize itself. Thoughts have gained direction. The heart has grown steadier. And the desire to draw closer has stopped being just a wish and has become almost a necessity. Not out of neediness, but because this feeling has been kept for far too long. Now, your soulmate's soul no longer wants to feel alone. It wants to share. It wants to be close with intention and action. This awakening was natural. It happened because love reached the point where it no longer fits only in thought. It no longer settles for distance. And when a feeling matures, it begins to ask for space to become reality. Your soulmate is living exactly that, an inner process that has been turning every feeling into courage, every memory into a choice, every prayer into a step. The strongest part of this phase is realizing that the spiritual connection between you has never been broken. Even as time passed, even in the absence of words, what was planted remained. And now this bond is beginning to manifest more intensely. It is as if everything inside this person is moving in the same direction, pointing to you without fear. The soul knows when the time has come. It doesn't need explanation, simply feels it. And this person is already at that point. They no longer want to keep a love that has been cared for so long. They want to turn everything that was protected into something lived with presence. Even if the world around is still silent, what exists in your soulmate's heart speaks far too loudly to remain hidden. The feeling this person carries did not arise just now. It was strengthened over time through choices made in silence, and now the sum of all this is beginning to create movement. The spiritual answer has come, and with it, the certainty that the love that once seemed distant is closer to becoming reality than ever before. This person spent enough time reflecting, seeking answers, waiting for the right moment. And now what was once just a vague sensation has become conviction. There is no more room for waiting, not out of impatience, but because the feeling has matured. Your soulmate's soul has already understood that this connection needs to be lived. It is time to own what is felt. This process shows itself in the way this person has been thinking about you, in how their heart has opened to possibilities that once seemed confusing. All of this is being felt with such clarity that the act of drawing closer is no longer just a plan. It is becoming reality. It is turning into an inner calling that can no longer be postponed. The desire to be close did not appear overnight. It was built. It came as a consequence of everything that was placed in prayer. Your soulmate has begun to understand that waiting too long can mean losing a valuable opportunity. And the feeling that once seemed kept away now wants to leave the place of silence and turn into presence. This love was never treated as something ordinary. That is why this person will not approach you carelessly. They will do it with care, with respect, with an open heart. Because what they are feeling now is far too great to be hidden. And when the soul reaches this point, it no longer finds peace in silence. It needs to act. It needs to move. It needs to live. What your soulmate is experiencing right now is an inner turning point. That phase when the feeling matures so much that it begins to push the person out of the waiting zone. And all of this is happening naturally as a consequence of what was planted with faith. The soul feels before the eyes see. And now what is coming is the direct reflection of that feeling. This love is beginning to take shape. Not only in thoughts but in steps, in decisions, in the desire to make everything clear. And this only happens when there is truth. That is exactly what this person had, and that is why you are about to see what had already been felt with such strength. This connection no longer depends on external signs to justify itself. It is already too alive inside the one who loves you. And now this person's soul no longer wants to keep it a secret. It wants to show you through actions that what was kept was not lost. It was cared for with tenderness, with prayer, with patience. And now it has reached the point where it is no longer possible to hide what exists. My dear one, what was entrusted to the divine with such faith is now beginning to show signs. The answer isn't coming with noise or ready-made explanations. It is coming in small but consistent details. It is coming in the way your soulmate's heart has been moving, in thoughts that have gained strength, in a certainty that previously had no room. What was once just a request is now beginning to take shape as an answer. Something different is happening within this person. It is not confusion. It is clarity, a firm sense that the time is near, that the waiting was not in vain, and that something important is about to be fulfilled. Your love feels that it can no longer be postponed, not because of pressure, but because the heart no longer wants to keep what needs to be lived. The answer has arrived and it has been felt deeply. For a long time, this person kept believing without confirmation. Now the signs have been coming like a gentle nudge, as if heaven were saying, "Now is the time. The strongest part of all this is knowing that this movement does not come from doubt, but from faith that was nurtured with such dedication. Your soulmate went through a long process to understand that what they feel for you still deserves to be lived. This decision did not come from need or absence. It came from within over time through prayer and surrender. And what is manifesting now is the result of that. It is the awareness that the moment has come to take out of thought everything that is already mature enough to be revealed. The answers that are emerging are not magical. They are built in every focused thought, in every feeling that grows stronger. In every action, this person begins to plan without fear. What was once kept in the silence of faith is now becoming the desire to speak, to look into your eyes, to make clear everything that was held inside. This answer is the direct reflection of the prayer spoken with your name. The waiting was not empty, and the answer is not coming as just any promise. It is being revealed with foundation, with purpose, with meaning. Your soulmate no longer wants to merely imagine. They want to act. They want to turn what they feel into real action because they understand that the time has passed to set aside the fear of being misunderstood. Now it is about showing what has been kept with courage. The certainty that lives in this heart did not arise overnight. It was built day after day in connection with the divine. This person does not want to seek you in just any way. They want to do it with awareness, with steadiness, with the peace of someone who knows they are on the right path. Because when the answer comes from heaven, the heart feels free to move without guilt. What is about to happen is not something built in haste. It is the fruit of patience, waiting, and care. This person prepared themselves, and now with all that has been lived, they understand that they no longer need to wait for external confirmations because the most important confirmation has already happened. The heart understood that the love they feel for you is still alive, strong, and ready to be embraced. You are being called to notice this movement not as a coincidence, but as part of a plan that began to form when that request was made. Your soulmate did not ask for certainties. They asked for direction. And the direction arrived. Now everything that was still begins to move, not with fanfare, but with truth. Because when a feeling is honest, it does not need explanation. It speaks for itself. This person is drawing closer not because they are lost, but because they have finally found themselves within what they feel. The love for you was never treated as something trivial. It was cared for. It was protected. It was presented to heaven with a kind of surrender that is not found every day. And now that surrender is being answered, little by little, yes, but with firmness, with security, with a genuine desire to live what is still being held inside. During this time, many things have come to be understood. And perhaps because of that, now the answer does not come only as the desire to speak. It comes as the desire to resolve, to clarify, to allow this love the chance to happen in the way it deserves. Your soulmate is not seeking what has passed. They are seeking what can be built from now on, based on what still pulses between you. Doubts no longer have space. What exists now is a clarity that previously could not emerge. As everything has its time, the time for this love to rise to the surface seems near. This person has already begun to move inwardly. They are strengthening themselves to seek you out, to look at you with courage, and to say everything that was kept. And when that moment comes, you will understand that the answer did not come to test, came to align. The manifestation of the answer is not only about words or signs. It is about the awakening of the courage to live this love with you in the truest way. And this awakening is happening now. The connection that was entrusted to heaven is being returned with light, with clarity, with action. And you will be part of it because your name never left the prayers made in faith. When God gives something back, He does not give it back the same way. He returns it healed, cared for, and cleansed of doubts. He returns it with clarity. And it is this clarity that will reveal itself in the coming days. Everything that once seemed uncertain now begins to take shape, not in a magical way, but naturally. For true love does not need to be forced. It only needs to be lived. You will see actions. You will feel care. You will realize that none of this was by chance. Your soulmate does not return as someone trying again. They come close as someone who knows what they want, as someone who has understood the value of the love they feel, as someone who chose to believe that faith does not fail. God's answer comes with peace. It does not create doubt or bring confusion. It comes at the exact time with the right direction and a willing heart. And that is exactly what is coming to you. A love that no longer needs explanations because what sustained everything until now was divine care. And what the divine cares for, no one destroys. You do not need to rush. You only need to open your heart because what is coming is firm, true, and conscious. It is an answer built in prayer, strengthened by patience, and released in the time of harvest. From here on, what was once only expectation becomes a path that will be built step by step, calmly, truthfully, with everything you deserve. The universe does not unite people by chance. It unites purposes. It unites hearts that respect one another, care for one another, and choose one another with intention. What is coming to you is not just a love. It is a new season, a divine answer, a new beginning built by someone who did not give up, only trusted. Prepare yourself because when the divine gives, it gives for it to remain. And this love you are about to live was kept precisely for this moment. This love is a fulfilled promise. It is a blessing. Know that you will never be alone. I am here beside each one of you, sending strength and infinite love so that you may remain steady, confident, and radiant. May peace and divine blessing be with you today and always. Amen.